Because God's knowledge of our actions is dependent on what we choose. Do you not get it?
Hello, everybody. This is In Philosopher's Garb. I'm a Christian theologian, and I recently, like last night, stumbled across this video by Theist Brooks in which he is trying to argue for the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human free will. And in it, I think Theist Brooks makes some pretty significant philosophical blunders. And so, what I want to do in this video is critique Brooks's arguments and show the errors in them and show why, if you affirm free will, philosophically, you should affirm that God does not know exhaustively all future actions of the free creatures. And this is actually consistent with what the Bible says, but that's another topic. So with that said, let's go ahead and roll the clip and let's start responding to Brooks's arguments.
Which is, how can we have free will with an all-knowing God?
I have already answered this question, but since you are not getting it, I will dedicate a lengthy and thorough explanation.
So I want to point out first off that your explanation is neither lengthy nor thorough. It's not lengthy, it's 2 minutes long. Entire books are written about this subject. Second, this is not a thorough explanation. All you have done is you have recited a certain argument that is given by a famous Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig. However, this argument by Craig has been heavily critiqued by open theist Christian theologians such as Alan Rhoda. Your response does not engage with any of those critiques, and those are some of the issues that I'm going to bring up in this video. So no, this is not lengthy, this is not thorough. Maybe in TikTok wall this is lengthy and thorough, but let's tone down the rhetoric a bit.
So buckle up.
I am not saying that foreknowledge means causation, but I am saying that foreknowledge necessitates a fixed future.
No, it doesn't. There's literally a logical fallacy named after your mistake. It's called the modal scope fallacy. Necessarily, God knows what we will do, but it does not logically follow that necessarily we will do that thing. And we know this is true because God's knowledge of our actions is dependent on what we choose. Do you not get it?
Okay, so the gentleman in question wasn't committing a modal scope fallacy, but I'm just going to look past that because I want to focus on this last part that he says, that God's knowledge is dependent on our actions. Don't you get it? So this is where I think the philosophical blunders are really going to start to come into play. One can maintain that there is an inconsistency between exhaustive divine foreknowledge and free will, not because of some type of connection between God knowing something and there being a causal connection with our actions, but because these two things entail propositions that are mutually inconsistent. And I've actually explained this issue before in another video, and since I'm lazy, I'm just going to play that brief snip where I explain this while making the same argument against Mike of Inspiring Philosophy. So let's go ahead and roll that clip. To say that God knows something is to say that it is true. That's an implication. And so many proponents of open theism would say that there is a contradiction between saying that there are future truths about my actions and also maintaining that these future actions are free. Let me explain why. Suppose you perform some action like raising your right hand. For that action to be free, it needs to be the case that you were free to do otherwise at that time. Or to put it another way, before you raised your hand, there were multiple ways that things could have gone. You could have raised your right hand, you could have raised your left hand, you could have kicked the wall, you could have picked your nose, so on and so forth. Before you made the choice to raise your right hand, there was a contingency that had not yet been resolved. However, when you freely make the choice to raise your right hand, you lock in your choice. Now let's ask the question, why is it the case that this contingency was actualized but not these others? Why is the statement, James raised his right hand, true instead of false? If we want to affirm libertarian free will, then the answer to this question needs to be the fact that James made this type of choice, right? And I need to be the explanation. Me making that choice needs to be the explanation for why that statement is true. Put simply, when James makes the choice at time t1, me making that choice is what resolves the contingency. Or put another way, James's choice is what grounds the truth of this proposition. But now we can start to see the issue. Let's go back to, let's say, t0. If my act of choosing at T1 is what resolves the contingency and grounds the truth of this proposition, then before I act, the contingency has not yet been resolved. The proposition, James raises his right hand at T1, that isn't yet true because the thing that grounds the truth of that proposition has not yet occurred. This is why open theists usually maintain that propositions such as James will do X are either all false or neither true nor false. So the issue here isn't about God and his foreknowledge. The issue is about how propositions about future actions can be true when the very thing which resolves the contingency has not yet happened. Saying God foreknows an act, again, entails that these types of future propositions are true, but the ability for them to be true is what is at issue here for many open theists.
And God is outside of time, and so sees all events as completed in the same way as we humans see the past. But just as our knowledge of the past does not mean that the past could not have been otherwise, so the same with God's knowledge and our actions.
Okay, so there are several problems here. First, the idea that God is outside of time is nowhere supported in the Bible, and I would say it actually directly contradicts the Bible. So, Christian philosopher Ryan Mullins has written extensively on the topic of divine temporality. He has a really good recent book on that called "From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker," in which he goes through different conceptions of God's relationship to time. But put simply, to say that God is outside time is to say that God is timeless. That is going to say that God does not experience secession, that God does not experience the type of before and after relationships, that God doesn't change in any way, things like that. All of that directly contradicts Scripture. So, for instance, in Scripture, we say God saying things like, I was mad, but you made me madder. Okay, that implies secession. I was like this, but then I was like this. There was this before and after. We think that God becomes a man. There is a before God is incarnate, and then God's incarnate, and then Jesus dies and exalted. God experiences before and after relations. So this is a whole area to discuss. I'm going to reference people to Ryan Mullins' work on that. That's not going to get you anywhere. You can't just hand wave to God being outside time. Now, second, and more importantly, Brooks is drawing on a specific philosophical conception of how time works, which you might call a static theory of time or a B theory of time. So under a B theory of time, all of the space-time continuum, it can be kind of thought of as a existing four-dimensional block, right? So the past and the future, the difference between the past and the future is the difference between like my hand being here and my hand being here. It's not a matter of like one existing and then the other coming into existence. It all exists kind of eternally in this block. And so this is the type of framework that Theist Brooks is using, because his argument wants to go, oh, well, this is just, it's always been there. Like the past is just as real to God as the present. God can look at the past, he can look at the present, and so he can have this type of foreknowledge. Okay, so this is crucial to Brooks's argument here. There's a really big problem with this, though, is if you affirm a B theory of time, you can't have free will. This is something I talk about in my critique of Mike Jones on this very topic. So again, I'm going to be lazy and play my remarks about that here. And to understand why this model of time can't allow for free will, consider this quote by Christian philosopher William Hasker. If the future already exists in all its concrete particularity, then where are the alternative possibilities that, as Roger agrees, are needed for free will? How is it possible for the agent to act any differently than in the already existing future she does in fact act? Ryan Mullins cites this quote from Hasker in his work and adds, "It is always eternally the case that S's choosing B at T2 is part of the four-dimensional continuum. This is just as much so before the choice is made as after it has been made. There is no time whatever at which an actual alternative is possible." Okay, so to summarize that, the very model of time that Brooks wants to appeal to in order to kind of explain how God can know our free actions is going to be a model which denies the possibility of us having free actions. But it gets worse, right? So it gets worse than this, because not only does it deny all free actions, if you take this model of time, it is going to entail a whole bunch of things that I don't think Theist Brooks is going to want to entail. If you hold to this model of time, then I am as eternal as God is. Sincerely, this is what follows from this model of time. Because if God exists and he's outside of time, and you have this kind of space dimension, this four-dimensional kind of block of time that's just existing alongside God, under this model of time, that block of the space-time continuum, it is co-eternal with God. Because if you say God exists alone, and then there's this block of time, well, now you have God in time. Now God has succession, God has before and after relationships, but you've denied that. So this denies creation ex nihilo. Creation has always been under Brooks' model of time that he's proposing. Creation has always just kind of been there, eternally existing with God. It's all equally, real to him. So you're denying creation ex nihilo, which I think a lot of Christians are going to want to like push back on. Regardless of whether or not it's true, they're probably going to come from a tradition which wants to push back on that. So that's a big one. It's going to entail that you are eternally existing with God. Seems pretty hinky, right? Because again, if from God's point of view, there is a before you come into existence existence and then you come into existence, that is going to contradict Brooks' framework in which he wants to say, oh, but God can always just look and see your actions up there. It's just as real to you up there. So he can't allow for that. Not only that, this is going to severely hamper certain theological truths. So under Brooks' model, under this theory of time, Jesus is eternally on the cross. He's eternally hanging on the cross in that slice of the four-dimensional block, which is all equally present to God. The model that Brooks is proposing, evil is never ultimately defeated. In the kind of space-time block, you have a section of it where evil is eternally present in this section, and then you have this other section, like, okay, evil's not out here, but it is eternally the case that God's creation, this block, looked at as a whole, there's always evil over here. Jesus is always hanging on the cross over here. He's always being attacked by the forces of Satan. It's always there. That never goes away. So evil is never ultimately defeated.
This becomes even more clear when you understand the definitions. Free will is the ability to choose otherwise. Knowledge is just true beliefs or ideas. With that, how could a certainly true belief somehow affect the causal powers in my brain to choose something? That makes no sense.
Okay, but again, because this isn't about the belief in question causing something regarding you. This isn't about God's true belief engaging in some type of causal action on your body. The issue here is, how can there be true propositions about what you will do, like that, that you will for sure do this? How can that be the case? How can there be those true propositions if the thing that resolves the contingency, if the thing that, in a sense, the truth is grounded upon, has not happened yet? If the thing that makes, if this proposition is true in virtue of this thing you do, how can this be true if you haven't done this yet? That's the problem here. It's not about having a belief causing something here. This, again, Brooks is regurgitating William Lane Craig, but he is not engaging in the philosophical literature surrounding the nuances of this topic, which, listen, I used to do this too, okay? You can go back and you can find me making these same arguments on my TikTok in the past. Like, I'm not bashing him as a person. These are things that if you don't know it, you don't know it. But like, there are issues here, and I think Brooks needs to bring his confidence and his kind of cockiness down a little bit, engaging with this other gentleman, because even if the other gentleman isn't articulating the problem correctly, there is a serious problem here that Brooks is not tracking on. He's not tracking on what the actual issue is.
That's why I gave the analogy of an infallible barometer. So in this case, the barometer knows with certainty what weather will occur in the future. But obviously, this device does not necessitate or determine the weather. Necessarily, the barometer will know what weather occurs, but it did not have to occur, and it did not cause it. The knowledge of the barometer is dependent on the weather, but it does not have a necessity or causal relation.
Okay, so this weather barometer, like, comparison analogy, this is again something that Brooks is drawing from William Lane Craig on, and he is ignoring the significant problems in this analogy. In fact, I've already talked about the problems with this analogy in a previous different video than the one I've already cited. So again, I'm going to be lazy and I'm just going to cite that video where I explain how this is not comparable to the issue at hand. So this analogy breaks down when one recognizes a pretty serious discontinuity in the analogy. The reading of the barometer are causally grounded by the existence of something in reality at the time of the reading. The reading of the weather barometer is never chronologically prior to the physical reality which grounds its readings. Additionally, if this barometer is 100% accurate and never fails, that means that at the time of the reading, there is something present in our physical reality which causally entails the occurrence of what it predicts. If there was nothing in our physical reality which causally entails the predicted event, then it would be possible for the barometer to be wrong, but you've already said it can't be. So with this aspect of the analogy in mind, if we applied this to God, that means that if God knows you're going to do something, that means there is something in reality which grounds that knowledge. But you've already said that the thing which grounds God's knowledge is your action. And 10,000 years ago, your action had not been made. Therefore, 10,000 years ago, God didn't know your action.
I really hope you get the point and see the analogy. Just asserting that I did not answer the question won't cut it.
And I hope you get the point that I've made in this video, which is that you are not adequately engaging with the actual issue here, and that the analogies you are pointing to, not only are they disanalogous and don't support your position, is that if we were to really take these analogies to their fruition, they would imply the opposite of what you want them to apply, as I just discussed in the barometer example.
I've known about this problem for over 5 years and literally read books on the topic.
It seems like all the books that you've read on this topic on the last 5 years have come from people who primarily already agree with your philosophical commitment because you did not show engagement with the significant issues in this type of thought and these type of arguments that have been pointed out by open theists. So, for instance, Alan Rhoda, who is a very well-known, prominent open theist who has written great books on this topic, including responses to William Lane Craig. So just because you've read it doesn't mean you've adequately heard the other person's side and heard the philosophical issues. And I want to point out, since you seem to primarily be drawing from William Lane Craig in this, as someone who I used to be a huge William Lane Craig fanboy. I mean, I followed him for years, and I think he has some really great stuff out there. While he does have some great stuff out there, on a lot of issues, Craig just is really, really bad. He blunders really hard in philosophy. He blunders really hard in biblical studies. At this point in my life, I've written 2 separate books. This was my doctorate dissertation, and in it, I critique William Lane Craig in at least, I think, 3 different chapters of him just being inconsistent in his philosophical thought or him making bad arguments. This, which is about a completely separate topic, this is about atonement. I have an entire chapter in there where I talk about penal substitution, and I engage with how Craig butchers the biblical data surrounding penal substitution with that. Craig's arguments about foreknowledge, they were just another area where Craig butchers it. I'm not bashing Craig as a person. I'm not saying everything he's done is wrong or useless. He's put some good stuff out, but Craig ain't perfect. So you can't just blindly follow William Lane Craig, which it seems like you're doing in this video.
So stop coping and address my other answers as well.
Okay, so I want to conclude this video by saying that your bravado and your arrogance about, oh, you're coping, oh, I'll explain this to you thoroughly. This ends up just being really embarrassing to you when throughout the video you make the errors and the issues that I've illustrated and I've talked about in this one. And side note, there were issues you committed in this video that I didn't even touch on. I mean, I could have really roasted you for you misusing the label modal scope fallacy. Like, I could have gone off on that, and I set that aside and I tried to focus on the major things, so we won't even get into that. So maybe just in general, when you're engaging with these people who are making these arguments, don't overestimate your own knowledge. Don't overestimate your own abilities. I know you're a young guy. I think you're like in college, something like that. You don't know everything there is to know. I don't know everything there is to know either. So maybe just like let's all take the rhetoric and let's just like really push it down a level because like your knowledge is not proportional to your confidence on this.